Last year, the 56-year-old owns two homes side by side just outside the village of Torfichan in West Lothian. At the time of the incident, he was living in the newer of the two properties. The second house was unoccupied, and spotting an opportunity, Sterling's son Grant decided to have a party for 9 of his friends, 6 boys and 4 girls aged between 14 and 17. However, he decided not to tell his parents. On returning home from visiting an elderly friend, William Sterling found his wife and daughter in a distressed state, fearing the unoccupied house was being burgled. Taking 2 friends with him for support, Sterling entered the old house with a .22 rifle, not realising his son was one of those partying inside. When he got inside, despite realising his son was there, he separated the boys from the girls, lined the boys up in the hallway, and waving the gun in their direction said, "If you fly with the crows, you get shot with them." For many of the youngsters left traumatised by that night's events, the memories are still as clear as day.
Extremely terrified. I was just in complete panic and shock. I didn't know what was happening. Everything was in a daze. I didn't know what was going on at all.
We've been through a year of stress, and I can't describe how we feel. We're just so happy that we've had this come up and with my son too.
In jailing William Sterling, Sheriff Ian Donaldson said he had taken into account his reputation and character, describing it as a tragedy that he had to jail a man of Sterling's age with a clean record. But he did so, he said, in the hope that it would act as a further deterrent against the use of guns in any situation in the future.
Donald Dewar faced the embarrassing prospect of a common censure after claims the Scottish Secretary asked a Labour MP to hand over a confidential Commons report. David Stewart had been forced to resign from the Scottish Affairs Committee, but he said Mr Dewar approached him asking for details of the report, which had already been widely leaked to newspapers. Our Westminster correspondent Michael Crow reported.
Inverness MP David Stewart was in hiding today, but it's the resignation letter he released late last night that is causing all the damage to the Scottish Secretary. In it he writes, "When Donald contacted me, and I also agreed to let him see the relevant parts of the report." The document in question was a controversial Scottish Affairs Select Committee report, which was part leaked to the Herald newspaper. When questioned today, Donald Dewar refused to deny the allegations that he had approached David Stewart for other extracts from the report.
It appeared to my certain knowledge in the Scotsman, the Herald, the London Times, the Daily Telegraph, and in every broadcast media. So I think to say that the circumstances were anything other than special would be very unfair.
But the Conservative MP who uncovered the story says Donald Dewar has committed an extremely serious offence because he made the approach.
All of that suggests that Donald Dewar initiated the contacts to get his hands on a leaked Select Committee report, and that is a much more serious matter than ministers accidentally getting their hands on one.
The SNP is now calling for the Scottish Secretary to resign.
The question has to be raised, if David Stewart, because of this, is resigning from the Select Committee, then why isn't Donald Dewar resigning and accepting responsibility as Secretary of State for Scotland?
There is no doubt that the Secretary of State should not have seen this leaked report. In the circumstances of the nature of the original leak to the Herald, he was entitled to know a bit more about what was going on.
The matter is now in the hands of the highly influential Standards and Privileges Committee, which can discipline the Secretary of State. And while Donald Dewar has indicated that he has nothing to hide, the whole affair could be seriously damaging for him, especially in the run-up to the elections on May the 6th.
A man who spent half his life in prison for a murder experts now say was never murder has told Scotland Today he still has faith in Scottish justice. 4 leading pathologists agree that the forensic evidence presented at Andrew Smith's trial was wrong. But in his first television interview, he says he's convinced the same system which jailed him for 22 years will now set him free. Dave Cowan reported.
1977, the Queen was celebrating her Jubilee, and Andrew Smith became an 18-year-old convicted murderer. 22 years later, he gets on with his work placement at a church in Forfar and expresses a belief many may find startling.
I have a respect still for justice. It's not totally destroyed. This is why I believe that if it takes 40 years or 25 years or 30 years, it will get sorted out.
Smith was jailed following a fight in this pub in Lark Hall. He admits punching the victim, Richard Cunningham, once and in self-defence. Mr Cunningham later died from a fractured skull, and at Smith's trial, forensic scientists said the injury was caused when he was kicked on the head as he lay helpless on the ground.
I have never kicked an animal, not let alone a human being. I punched him and ran. You know, he was locking the door, you know, so I punched him and bolted, you know.
4 leading pathologists now believe Mr. Cunningham fractured his skull when he fell onto the floor, clearing Smith of murder, if not a lesser charge. 8 months ago, his lawyer sent the fresh evidence to the Scottish Secretary, asking for permission to appeal. He's still waiting for a response.
The case itself is relatively simple, straightforward. It relates to medical evidence and really nothing else, and I feel it should have been done much, much quicker.
The Scottish office says the request is still being considered, along with around 20 other cases. Smith, meanwhile, believes he will clear his name.
If you don't have that belief, and at the end of the day, you know, the system buries you, the system destroys you, and you become the cabbage after that, you know.
Andrew Smith refuses to cooperate with the parole board. He says he wants to leave prison a free man with his murder conviction quashed. If that doesn't happen, he says he's prepared to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
It's time for a short break now, but don't go away. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back. Let's continue our review of the stories that were in the news in the last week. An ex-soldier has been jailed for 4 years for kidnapping 2 15-year-old prostitutes in Glasgow. It put them through a terrifying ordeal after they stole his wallet and mobile phone. The case again highlights the dangers of women, especially of teenage girls, working the city's streets. Dave Cameron reports.
Offshore oil worker Carl Dodson was portrayed in court today as a man who'd kept out of trouble for most of his life and had felt sorry for the 2 teenage prostitutes until he realised they'd robbed him. Dodson had picked up the 15-year-olds in Glasgow's Anderston area. They were dishevelled, and he decided to take them to his house in Erskine. They passed an innocent night together, but the next day Dodson discovered they'd stolen his wallet and phone. At this car park, he forced the girls into the boot of his car and drove off. He freed them a little later, said sorry, and drove them back to Erskine, where he tried to make amends. He later had sex with one of the youngsters.
Dodson's defence advocate Mike O'Grady said his client accepted his behaviour had been appalling, with a very bad outburst of temper that had terrible results. But Mr O'Grady asked the judge not to jail him, saying Dodson had shown immediate remorse and adding he has done one terrible thing in the course of an otherwise pretty much exemplary life.
Lord Penrose said the girls had suffered a terrifying ordeal and jailed Dodson for 4 years. In Glasgow today, the story saddened but did not surprise those who work with the city's prostitutes.
As far as we know at the moment, there are a small number of girls who maybe go onto the streets occasionally. It isn't as though we've got a large number of teenagers out there regularly. But it is a subject of great concern because these girls are very vulnerable.
Funding from the government is being spent on a new initiative to protect Glasgow's working girls from the likes of Dodson. It will also try to stop them going on the game in the first place.
Scots miners suffering from lung diseases will not be sharing in a £2 billion government compensation scheme. The government is to make the payout to English and Welsh miners, but a legal loophole means a separate deal will have to be struck before their Scottish counterparts can be compensated. Roddy Scott reports.
Now 69, Eddie Henry was a miner for 38 years. Like so many other young men in the late 40s, he had few career choices, the railways, shipbuilding or mining. Now he is paying for his decision. He suffers from chronic bronchitis and emphysema as a result of inhaling coal dust during his career.
You don't have what you would say a great quality of life. I've got a dog there, and it's only 3-year-old, and that dog should be getting walked. And I can't do it. Can't walk it every day.
It was announced in Cardiff today that up to 100,000 ex-miners across the UK are to share in a compensation deal totalling more than £2 billion. Miners' leaders in Scotland, however, believe that loopholes exist in Scottish law that may entitle them to more money than their southern counterparts, but claim the Department of Trade and Industry have ignored their calls for further discussion on the issue.
For one reason or another, we've never heard from them. We've never been invited to discuss them until yesterday afternoon, and nor have they seen fit to put any written response to us.
The Department of Trade and Industry, however, are confused as to what the fuss is all about.
We're setting up test centres already, and including centres in Scotland where minors can go, be tested and get the compensation. We're already paying out interim payments to minors and their families in Scotland. So I don't really think that we ought to get hung up on the minor differences between English and Scottish law, because there's a better settlement on offer now.
The two sides are due to meet on Tuesday in a bid to resolve the issue.
Plans to reform Scotland's divorce laws to allow couples to end their marriage more quickly will not undermine family life, according to the government. Under new proposals unveiled this week, people wanting to divorce would have to wait only a year before it is finalised. Minister said that the aim is to protect children, not to make splitting up easier. But the Church of Scotland claimed the government's treading a fine line. Here's Liz Monaghan.
Divorce in Scotland is on the increase. 40% of marriages are failing, and many couples end up here at family mediation.
She won't speak about it. I mean, she's complete. I mean, there's a barrier going up. No, you cannot see the children. And I've told her at the end of the day, she will not stop me seeing my children.
This is a reconstruction, but for many people, the scenes being acted out are all too real. In 1997, there were over 29,500 marriages. That same year, 12,000 couples divorced, and children were involved in 20% of those cases. Today, as part of the government's commitment to the family, a new consultation paper was launched, which could mean couples getting a divorce in a year.
I think what we've got to take into account is that divorce can be a very painful process. What we're seeking to do is to try and minimise the disturbance to children in particular. We want the process not to be easier, but to be more sympathetic to children.
I think that the consultation paper gives us a framework, within which people can make their own decisions. It's not attempting to, prescribe the way forward, but trying to create a more supportive framework for people to organise their own lives.
But some church leaders say they're worried the plans could in fact undermine the family.
I wouldn't like them to be interpreted as presenting a quick and easy solution to marriage problems, because divorce is never painless or less than traumatic.
But with so many marriages now ending in divorce, everyone is in agreement that the present system isn't working and that something has to be done.
Local councils are to be given new powers to raid unlicensed bedsits in students' flats. The Scottish Secretary, Donald Dewar, this week announced a clampdown after 2 Glasgow students died last month in a fire in an unregistered flat. Roddy Scott reported.
Today's news comes too late for the 2 Glasgow students killed earlier this month when a fire ripped through their basement flat in Glasgow's West End. Bars on the windows preventing Daniel Heron and James Fraser from escaping. The flat's landlord, Harry Singh, had not bothered to obtain a licence for the property. Now the government is to make the registration of multiple occupancy flats with local councils compulsory. In the past, this has always been done on a voluntary basis, making it virtually impossible to implement and opening the door to rogue landlords unwilling to pay the price necessary for the upkeep of the flats. All too often the properties are allowed to fall into disrepair, and some, like this one, become death traps. Council officials will now have the power to withhold licences where there are fears over safety or sanitation and search those premises suspected of not having a licence.
This is really important for tenants who will know that they have the law on their side and will know that they can insist on adequate standards. And so it's an extremely good move in terms of safety. I think there are other issues to look at as well, like adequate heating in houses and fair charges as well. But this vital life or death matter is something that is really good to see.
The news has been given a guarded welcome by student representatives.
We broadly welcome these proposed new laws, and we believe that these proposed new laws are common sense. However, we would now like to see the government give a serious financial commitment to ensure that these proposed new laws are effectively and properly administered.
The true test of the proposed legislation will indeed be in the success of its implementation.
Rebel Labour MP Dennis Canavan handed in his nomination papers to stand as an independent for the Scottish Parliament. The move means Mr Canavan will now be automatically expelled from the Labour Party, as he will be opposing its official candidate in the elections on May the 6th. Dave Cowan reported.
A last read of the small print, and Dennis Canavan signs away 25 years as a Labour MP and 33 years as a member of the Labour Party. He's breached its rules by standing against Labour's official candidate for Falkirk West and now faces automatic expulsion. Mr Canavan decided to stand after the party chose another candidate for the seat he's represented since 1983. Having handed his papers into Falkirk Council, he announced he'll stand under the banner of the Member of Parliament for Falkirk West.
I would still like to stand as the official Labour Party candidate. It is within the power of people at Labour Party headquarters to achieve that.
Mr Canavan's been a Labour MP since the days of Harold Wilson. Today the party said he's expelled himself and can't return to the fold for 5 years.
I am saddened if this does lead to a break between me and the Labour Party. I was virtually born and brought up in the Labour Party. I've still got a lot of friends in the Labour Party, and I hope that that friendship and comradeship continues.
If he wins, Mr Canavan will resign from his Westminster seat, forcing a by-election which will cause the government even more discomfort. He'll debate the issues with his Labour and SNP opponents on Platform on this channel at 11:30 tomorrow night.
Railtrack announced that Scotland's railways and stations are to see £2 billion worth of investment over the next 10 years. The cash is to tackle serious problems which the network is facing, and it's meant to counter criticism that Railtrack is concentrating too much on profits and not enough on improving the system. Our business correspondent Alan Sonby reported.
Improvements to track, station services and facilities follow years of neglect, according to Railtrack, which says the £2 billion programme takes account of a 30% anticipated growth in rail passengers and a trebling of freight on the network. Railtrack plans a 10% reduction in delays over the next 2 years to deliver passengers from Glasgow to London in under 4 hours by 2005, Edinburgh to London in 3.5 hours. There'll be 10 minutes off trains from Edinburgh to Aberdeen and Glasgow to Aberdeen by 2001. The Stirling to Alloa and Kincardine line will reopen, first for freight, then for passengers, at a cost of £10 million.
We are, with ScotRail, producing the most reliable and punctual train service in the UK, and that's a record that we're very proud of and we aim to build on in the next few years.
But with passenger traffic increasing in Scotland by 7.5% a year and freight 20%, is the planned investment enough?
Passenger growth has been far more than anyone expected. Freight growth has been the same. So yes, we've got to keep a very close watch to make sure that they are really planning enough additional capacity.
Critics say Scotland's system's rubbish, while it's among the best in the UK. Inevitably, when something is renewed, it's modernised. How far the system will be enhanced in the future is still a matter of continuing debate.
A major part of the government's education policy has been criticised as being fundamentally flawed. A study by Edinburgh University for the country's largest teaching union says that target setting is based on a false premise. The union has called on the government to justify comparing schools through exam performance and says the system must be completely overhauled. Ross Harper reported.
Target setting is part of the government's drive for standards. Comparing schools to see how they're performing has long been a source of controversy. Under the Conservatives, league tables of exam results on their own were published. The present system also takes into account the economic circumstances of the school by counting the number of free school meals pupils take.
The government knew that crude exam results were wholly inadequate and rejected that, and we agree with them in that respect, although they're continuing to publish them curiously. But what they've done is really no better at all. The statistical model they're using is completely invalid, completely unreliable, and however well motivated they may be, the system they've adopted is simply not fit for the purpose.
The main parents' organisation agrees.
It's a way of saying we're looking after the pounds, whereas everybody knows if you look after the pennies, the pounds look after themselves. In this situation, the pupils are the pennies. If you focus on the pupils and make sure that they're all doing the best they can, then you get more pounds.
But the government says they consulted widely before using meals as a guide. They admit it's not a perfect system.
Because of that, we've made it clear to schools that they don't need to use the free school meals criteria if they would prefer to use some other measure. But the important thing about target setting is that you have to start somewhere. And indeed, year-on-year measurement is now what is important.
And whoever is in charge of Scottish education after the elections may find getting agreement on setting targets is their hardest task.
The cut-price airline Ryanair has confirmed it'll be putting on more cheap flights from Prestwick this summer, creating 40 jobs in the process. The Irish-owned airline plans a second daily flight to Paris and intends to open more international routes, boosting Scotland's direct links with Europe. Our business correspondent Alan Sonby reported.
5 years ago, Ryanair started flying from Prestwick to Dublin. London Stansted was added in 1995 and Paris last November. Ryanair will now add a second flight to Paris, Beauvais and offer 6 trips per day to Stansted. It expects thousands of extra French visitors to create hundreds of spin-off jobs in the Scottish economy, as well as the 30 direct jobs at Prestwick. Responding to the challenge, Air France has introduced 3 times a day flights to Glasgow. From Edinburgh Airport, there'll be new routes to Frankfurt, Vienna and Bâle this summer. But Ryanair says the key to its expansion is low fares and plans to buy new 189-seater planes to handle the demand for low-cost seats.
We've had discussions and are having continuing discussions with the management of the airport, and I would expect certainly to be basing aircraft and to be launching other flights and indeed increase capacity on existing routes from Prestwick in the not-too-distant future.
But freight carrier Federal Express, one of Prestwick's biggest customers, has threatened to pull out or scale down its operations in Scotland because of restrictive aviation rules that limit its freedom to fly onwards with freight for third countries.
I think we need to dwell on the fact that many Scottish manufacturing and service companies rely on that excellent service through Prestwick, and that would be the real shame if that were lost.
Ryanair says its Prestwick to Paris-Beauvais service is only the start. There are many secondary airports across Europe where its low-cost, no-frills philosophy could apply. More international flights from Prestwick, it says, is only a matter of time.
The first council houses to be built in Easterhouse for a quarter of a century were officially opened on Wednesday. Ironically, they could also be among the very last council homes ever to be built in the city of Glasgow. Councillors look certain to endorse plans for the entire housing stock to be handed over to local community companies. As Christina McIntyre reported, that's not a prospect which pleases everyone.
The old, damp, dreary flats with no showers or central heating. The new 20 semi-detached houses with gardens, central heating, even patio doors. Bernard Kelly spent 40 years in the old. He's looking forward to a further few in the new.
Well, it's like day and night as far as the houses go. We're over there a long time, as you know, 40 years, but entirely different house altogether, you know. Something I always wanted.
Neighbour Annie Nolan lived across the close in the flats. Now she's next door.
I never thought I'd see a house like that. You know, 40 years over there is a long time to stay in a house. But these are really lovely houses. It's worth waiting for.
The development, which has been named Millennium Gardens, will be Glasgow City Council's last new build project this century, and it could be the last ever if plans to transfer Glasgow's housing stock to community trusts in order to wipe out a debt of £1 billion get the go-ahead. Former Lord Provost Peter McCann claims that would be shameful.
Housing is a home for the people. It's got to have their strength, they've got to have their security of tenure. That's what Labour policy is about. It's not handing over your responsibilities simply for money.
I find it pathetic, in fact quite frankly annoying, that people should argue about how you do the houses. What's important to me as convener is that people get houses like this. And if that means a new vehicle for doing it, let's have the courage to grasp that.
For the tenants of Millennium Gardens, the stock transfer row means nothing. As far as they're concerned, they've been given the best start to the 21st century they could ask for.
Fears have been expressed for the future of the historic Iona Abbey and the community that lives within it. A Church of Scotland report said that religious community may have to leave the building as a result of ongoing discussions about its maintenance. John Mackay had the story.
Iona Abbey was transformed from being an ancient ruin into a thriving religious centre in various stages over the last 100 years. Now it's feared that could change again. Historic Scotland has been approached by the trustees of the Abbey to take over the maintenance of the building. That has caused anxiety among some that the Iona community, Church of Scotland movement established there more than 60 years ago, may have to move out.
One has to say that if the discussions break down, the cathedral trustees will have to consider what next, and it might be hard to see how the Iona community can continue to be there, but we shall certainly be involved in these discussions in as constructive and creative way as we can be.
The community claim that if they left the Abbey, it would lose its vibrancy and become what the report describes as just another ancient monument. For its part, Historic Scotland has not made any suggestion that the community should leave. but issues of access to the Abbey and the significance of the Iona Community Shop have still to be resolved.
It's time for another short break now, but don't go away. We are back in a couple of minutes.